The Tears of Ah Kim. By Jack London. There was a great noise and racket, but no scandal, in Honolulu's Chinatown. Those within hearing distance merely shrugged their shoulders and smiled tolerantly at the disturbance as an affair of accustomed usualness. "What is it?" asked Chin Mo, down with a sharp pleurisy, of his wife, who had paused for a second at the open window to listen. "Only Ah Kim," was her reply. "His mother is beating him again." The fracas was taking place in the garden, behind the living rooms that were at the back of the store that fronted on the street with the proud sign above, A.H. Kim Company, General Merchandise. The garden was a miniature domain, 20 feet square, that somehow cunningly seduced the eye into a sense and seeming of illimitable vastness. There were forests of dwarf pines and oaks, centuries old yet 2 or 3 feet in height, and imported at enormous care and expense. A tiny bridge, a pace across, arched over a miniature river that flowed with rapids and cataracts from a miniature lake stocked with myriad finned, orange-miracled goldfish that in proportion to the lake and landscape were whales. On every side the many windows of the several-storied shack buildings looked down. In the center of the garden, on the narrow graveled walk close beside the lake, Ah Kim was noisily receiving his beating. No Chinese lad of tender and beatable years was Ah Kim. His was the store of Ah Kim Company, and his was the achievement of building it up through the long years from the shoestring of savings of a contract coolie laborer to a bank account in 4 figures and a credit that was gilt-edged. An even half-century of summers and winters had passed over his head, and, in the passing, fattened him comfortably and snugly. Short of stature, his full front was as rotund as a watermelon seed. His face was moon-faced. His garb was dignified and silken, and his black silk skullcap with the red button atop, now, alas, fallen on the ground, was the skullcap worn by the successful and dignified merchants of his race. But his appearance, in this moment of the present, was anything but dignified. Dodging and ducking under a rain of blows from a bamboo cane, he was crouched over in a half-doubled posture. When he was rapped on the knuckles and elbows, with which he shielded his face and head, his winces were genuine and involuntary. From the many surrounding windows the neighborhood looked down with placid enjoyment. And she who wielded the stick so shrewdly from long practice. 74 years old, she looked every minute of her time. Her thin legs were encased in straight-lined pants of linen, stiff, textured and shiny black. Her scraggly gray hair was drawn unrelentingly and flatly back from a narrow, unrelenting forehead. Eyebrows she had none, having long since shed them. Her eyes, of pinhole teeniness, were blackest black. She was shockingly cadaverous. Her shriveled forearm, exposed by the loose sleeve, possessed no more of muscle than several taut bowstrings stretched across meager bone under yellow, parchment-like skin. Along this mummy arm jade bracelets shot up and down and clashed with every blow. "Ah!" she cried out, rhythmically accenting her blows in series of 3 to each shrill observation. "I forbade you to talk to Li Faa. Today you stopped on the street with her. Not an hour ago. Half an hour by the clock you talked. What is that?" It was the thrice accursed telephone, Ah Kim muttered, while she suspended the stick to catch what he said. "Mrs. Chong Lucy told you." "I know she did. I saw her see me. I shall have the telephone taken out. It is of the devil." "It is a device of all the devils," Mrs. Tai Fu agreed, taking a fresh grip on the stick. "Yet shall the telephone remain. I like to talk with Mrs. Chong Lucy over the telephone." "She has the eyes of 10,000 cats," quoth Ah Kim, ducking and receiving the stick stinging on his knuckles. "And the tongues of 10,000 toads," he supplemented ere his next duck. "She is an impudent-faced and evil-mannered hussy," Mrs. Tai Fu accented. "Mrs. Chong Lucy was ever that," Ah Kim murmured like the dutiful son he was. "I speak of Li Faa," his mother corrected with stick emphasis. "She is only half Chinese, as you know. Her mother was a shameless Kanaka." She wears skirts like the degraded Haole women, also corsets, as I have seen for myself. Where are her children? Yet has she buried 2 husbands. The one was drowned, the other kicked by a horse. Kim qualified. A year of her, unworthy son of a noble father, and you would gladly be going out to get drowned or be kicked by a horse. Subdued chucklings and laughter from the window audience applauded her point. You buried 2 husbands yourself, revered mother, Kim was stung to retort. I had the good taste not to marry a third. Besides, my 2 husbands died honorably in their beds. They were not kicked by horses nor drowned at sea. What business is it of our neighbors that you should inform them I have had 2 husbands, or 10, or none? You have made a scandal of me, before all our neighbors, and for that I shall now give you a real beating. Kim endured the staccato rain of blows, and said when his mother paused, breathless and weary. Always have I insisted and pleaded, honorable mother, that you beat me in the house, with the windows and doors closed tight, and not in the open street or the garden open behind the house. You have called this unthinkably the silvery moon blossom, Mrs. Tai Fu rejoined, quite illogically and femininely, but with utmost success in so far as she deflected her son from continuance of the thrust he had so swiftly driven home. Mrs. Chung, Lucy told you, he charged. I was told over the telephone, his mother evaded. I do not know all voices that speak to me over that contrivance of all the devils. Strangely, Kim made no effort to run away from his mother, which he could easily have done. She, on the other hand, found fresh cause for more stick blows. Stubborn one! Why do you not cry? Mule that shameth its ancestors. Never have I made you cry. From the time you were a little boy I have never made you cry. Answer me. Why do you not cry? Weak and breathless from her exertions, she dropped the stick and panted and shook as if with a nervous palsy. I do not know, except that it is my way, Kim replied, gazing solicitously at his mother. I shall bring you a chair now, and you will sit down and rest and feel better. But she flung away from him with a snort and tottered agedly across the garden into the house. Meanwhile, recovering his skullcap and smoothing his disordered attire, Kim rubbed his hurts and gazed after her with eyes of devotion. He even smiled, and almost might it appear that he had enjoyed the beating. Kim had been so beaten ever since he was a boy, when he lived on the high banks of the 11th cataract of the Yangtze River. Here his father had been born and toiled all his days from young manhood as a towing coolie. When he died, Kim, in his own young manhood, took up the same honorable profession. Farther back than all remembered annals of the family, had the males of it been towing coolies. At the time of Christ his direct ancestors had been doing the same thing, meeting the precisely similarly modeled junks below the white water at the foot of the canyon, bending the half-mile of rope to each junk, and, according to size, tailing on from 100 to 200 coolies of them, and by sheer, two-legged manpower, bowed forward and down till their hands touched the ground and their faces were sometimes within a foot of it, dragging the junk up through the white water to the head of the canyon. Apparently, down all the intervening centuries, the payment of the trade had not picked up. His father, his father's father, and himself, Kim, had received the same invariable remuneration per junk 1/14 of a cent, at the rate he had since learned money was valued in Hawaii. On long lucky summer days when the waters were easy, the junks many, the hours of daylight 16 hours of such heroic toil would earn over a cent. But in a whole year a towing coolie did not earn more than $1.50. People could and did live on such an income. There were women servants who received a yearly wage of $1. The net makers of TY earned between $1 and $2 a year. They lived on such wages, or, at least, they did not die on them. But for the towing coolies there were pickings, which were what made the profession honorable and the guild a close and hereditary corporation or labor union. One junk in 5 that was dragged up through the rapids or lowered down was wrecked. One junk in every 10 was a total loss. The coolies of the towing guild knew the freaks and whims of the currents, and grappled, and raked, and netted a wet harvest from the river. They of the guild were looked up to by lesser coolies, for they could afford to drink brick tea and eat number 4 rice every day. And Ah Kim had been contented and proud, until, one bitter spring day of driving sleet and hail, he dragged ashore a drowning Cantonese sailor. It was this wanderer, thawing out by his fire, who first named the magic name Hawaii to him. He had himself never been to that laborer's paradise, said the sailor, but many Chinese had gone there from Canton, and he had heard the talk of their letters written back. In Hawaii was never frost nor famine. The very pigs, never fed, were ever fat of the generous offal disdained by man. A Cantonese or Yangtze family could live on the waist of an Hawaii coolie. And wages. In gold dollars, 10 a month, or, in trade dollars, 2 a month, was what the contract Chinese coolie received from the White Devil Sugar Kings. In a year the coolie received the prodigious sum of 240 trade dollars, more than 100 times what a coolie, toiling 10 times as hard, received on the 11th cataract of the Yangtze. In short, all things considered, an Hawaii coolie was 100 times better off, and, when the amount of labor was estimated, 1,000 times better off. In addition was the wonderful climate. When Ah Kim was 24, despite his mother's pleadings and beatings, he resigned from the ancient and honorable guild of the 11th cataract towing coolies, left his mother to go into a boss coolie's household as a servant for $1 a year, and an annual dress to cost not less than 30 cents, and himself departed down the Yangtze to the Great Sea. Many were his adventures and severe his toils and hardships ere, as a salt sea junk sailor, he won to Canton. When he was 26 he signed 5 years of his life and labor away to the Hawaii Sugar Kings and departed, one of 800 contract coolies, for that far island land, on a festering steamer run by a crazy captain and drunken officers and rejected of Lloyd's. Honorable, among laborers, had Ah Kim's rating been as a towing coolie. In Hawaii, receiving 100 times more pay, he found himself looked down upon as the lowest of the low-A plantation coolie, than which could be nothing lower. But a coolie whose ancestors had towed junks up the 11th cataract of the Yangtze since before the birth of Christ inevitably inherits one character in large degree, namely, the character of patience. This patience was Ah Kim's. At the end of 5 years, his compulsory servitude over, thin as ever in body, in bank account he lacked just 10 trade dollars of possessing 1,000 trade dollars. On this sum he could have gone back to the Yangtze and retired for life a really wealthy man. He would have possessed a larger sum, had he not, on occasion, conservatively played Che-Fa and Fan-Tan, and had he not, for a 12-month, toiled among the centipedes and scorpions of the stifling cane fields in the semi-dream of a continuous opium debauch. Why he had not toiled the whole 5 years under the spell of opium was the expensiveness of the habit. He had had no moral scruples. The drug had cost too much. But Ah Kim did not return to China. He had observed the business life of Hawaii and developed a vaulting ambition. For 6 months, in order to learn business and English at the bottom, he clerked in the plantation store. At the end of this time he knew more about that particular store than did ever plantation manager know about any plantation store. When he resigned his position he was receiving 40 gold a month, or 80 trade, and he was beginning to put on flesh. Also, his attitude toward mere contract coolies had become distinctively aristocratic. The manager offered to raise him to 60-fold, which, by the year, would constitute a fabulous 1,440 trade, or 700 times his annual earning on the Yangtze as a 2-legged horse at 1/14 of a gold cent per junk. Instead of accepting, Ah Kim departed to Honolulu, and in the big general merchandise store of Fong and Chow Fong began at the bottom for 15 gold per month. He worked a year and a half, and resigned when he was 33, despite the 75 gold per month his Chinese employers were paying him. Then it was that he put up his own sign, A.H. Kim Company, General Merchandise. Also, better fed, there was about his less meager figure a foreshadowing of the melon-seed rotundity that was to attach to him in future years. With the years he prospered increasingly, so that, when he was 36, the promise of his figure was fulfilling rapidly, and, himself a member of the exclusive and powerful Hai Gum Tong, and of the Chinese Merchants Association, he was accustomed to sitting as host at dinners that cost him as much as 30 years of towing on the 11th cataract would have earned him. Two things he missed, a wife, and his mother to lay the stick on him as of yore. When he was 37 he consulted his bank balance. It stood him 3,000 gold. For 2,500 down and an easy mortgage he could buy the 3-story shack building, and the ground in fee simple on which it stood. But to do this, left only 500 for a wife. Fuyipa had a marriageable, properly small-footed daughter whom he was willing to import from China, and sell to him for 800 gold, plus the costs of importation. Further, Fuyipa was even willing to take 500 down and the remainder on note at 6%. Ah Kim, 37 years of age, fat and a bachelor, really did want a wife, especially a small-footed wife, for, China born and reared, the immemorial small-footed female had been deeply impressed into his fantasy of woman. But more, even more and far more than a small-footed wife, did he want his mother and his mother's delectable beatings. So he declined Fuyipa's easy terms, and at much less cost imported his own mother from servant in a boss coolie's house at a yearly wage of $1.30 dressed to be mistress of his Honolulu 3-story shack building with 2 household servants, 3 clerks, and a porter of all work under her, to say nothing of $10,000 worth of dress goods on the shelves that ranged from the cheapest cotton crepes to the most expensive hand-embroidered silks. For be it known that even in that early day Ah Kim's emporium was beginning to cater to the tourist trade from the States. For 13 years Ah Kim had lived tolerably happily with his mother, and by her been methodically beaten for causes just or unjust, real or fancied, and at the end of it all he knew as strongly as ever the ache of his heart and head for a wife, and of his loins for sons to live after him, and carry on the dynasty of Ah Kim Company. Such the dream that has ever vexed men, from those early ones who first usurped a hunting right, monopolized a sandbar for a fish trap, or stormed a village and put the males thereof to the sword. Kings, millionaires, and Chinese merchants of Honolulu have this in common, despite that they may praise God for having made them differently and in self-likable images. And the ideal of woman that Ah Kim at 58 for had changed from his ideal at 37. No small-footed wife did he want now, but a free, natural, outstepping normal-footed woman that, somehow, appeared to him in his day dreams and haunted his night visions in the form of Li Faa, the silvery moon blossom. What if she were twice widowed, the daughter of a Kanaka mother, the wearer of white deviled skirts and corsets and high-heeled slippers? He wanted her. It seemed it was written that she should be joint ancestor with him of the line that would continue the ownership and management through the generations, of Ah Kim Company, General Merchandise. I will have no half-baked daughter-in-law, his mother often reiterated to Ah Kim, "Pake" being the Hawaiian word for Chinese. All pake must my daughter-in-law be, even as you, my son, and as I, your mother. And she must wear trousers, my son, as all the women of our family before her. No woman, in she-devil skirts and corsets, can pay due reverence to our ancestors. Corsets and reverence do not go together. Such a one is this shameless Li Faa. She is impudent and independent, and will be neither obedient to her husband nor her husband's mother. This brazen-faced Li Faa would believe herself the source of life and the first ancestor, recognizing no ancestors before her. She laughs at our joss, sticks, and paper prayers, and family gods, as I have been well told. Mrs. Chang Lucy, Ah Kim groaned. Not alone Mrs. Chang Lucy, O son. I have inquired. At least a dozen have heard her say of our Joss house that it is all monkey foolishness. The words are hers, she, who eats raw fish, raw squid, and baked dog. Ours is the foolishness of monkeys. Yet would she marry you, a monkey, because of your store that is a palace and of the wealth that makes you a great man. And she would put shame on me, and on your father before you long honorably dead. And there was no discussing the matter. As things were, Kim knew his mother was right. Not for nothing had Li Faa been born 40 years before of a Chinese father, renegade to all tradition, and of a Kanaka mother whose immediate forebears had broken the taboos, cast down their own Polynesian gods, and weak-heartedly listened to the preaching about the remote and unimaginable God of the Christian missionaries. Li Faa, educated, who could read and write English and Hawaiian and a fair measure of Chinese, claimed to believe in nothing, although in her secret heart she feared the kahunas, Hawaiian witch doctors, who she was certain could charm away ill luck or pray one to death. Li Faa would never come into Ah Kim's house, as he thoroughly knew, and kowtow to his mother and be slave to her in the immemorial Chinese way. Li Faa, from the Chinese angle, was a new woman, a feminist, who rode horseback astride, disported immodestly garbed at Waikiki on the surfboards, and at more than one luau feast, had been known to dance the hula with the worst and in excess of the worst, to the scandalous delight of all. Ah Kim himself, a generation younger than his mother, had been bitten by the acid of modernity. The old order held, in so far as he still felt in his subtlest crypts of being the dusty hand of the past resting on him, residing in him, yet he subscribed to heavy policies of fire and life insurance, acted as treasurer for the local Chinese revolutionizers that were for turning the Celestial Empire into a republic, contributed to the funds of the Hawaii-born Chinese baseball nine that excelled the Yankee nines at their own game, talked theosophy with Katsuo Saguri, the Japanese Buddhist and silk importer, fell for police graft, played and paid his insidious share in the democratic politics of annexed Hawaii, and was thinking of buying an automobile. Ah Kim never dared bear himself to himself and thrash out and winnow out how much of the old he had ceased to believe in. His mother was of the old, yet he revered her and was happy under her bamboo stick. Li Faa, the silvery moon blossom, was of the new, yet he could never be quite completely happy without her. For he loved Li Faa. Moon-faced, rotund as a watermelon seed, canny businessman, wise with half a century of living, nevertheless Ah Kim became an artist when he thought of her. He thought of her in poems of names, as woman transmuted into flower, terms of beauty and philosophic abstractions of achievement and easement. She was, to him, and alone to him of all men in the world, his plum blossom, his tranquility of woman, his flower of serenity, his moon lily, and his perfect rest. And as he murmured these love endearments of namings, it seemed to him that in them were the ripplings of running waters, the tinklings of silver wind bells, and the scents of the oleander and the jasmine. She was his poem of woman, a lyric delight, a three dimensions of flesh and spirit delicious, a fate and a good fortune written, ere the first man and woman were, by the gods whose whim had been to make all men and women for sorrow and for joy. But his mother put into his hand the ink brush and placed under it, on the table, the writing tablet. "Paint," said she, "the ideograph of T.O. Mary." He obeyed, scarcely wondering, with the deft artistry of his race and training painting the symbolic hieroglyphic. "Resolve it," commanded his mother. Ah Kim looked at her, curious, willing to please, unaware of the drift of her intent. "Of what is it composed?" she persisted. "What are the three originals, the sum of which is it, to marry, marriage, the coming together and wedding of a man and a woman? Paint them apart, the three originals, unrelated, so that we may know how the wise men of old wisely built up the ideograph of to marry." And Ah Kim, obeying and painting, saw that what he had painted were three picture signs, the picture signs of a hand, an ear, and a woman. "Name them," said his mother, and he named them. "It is true," said she. "It is a great tale. It is the stuff of the painted pictures of marriage. Such marriage was in the beginning, such shall it always be in my house. The hand of the man takes the woman's ear, and by it leads her away to his house, where she is to be obedient to him and to his mother. I was taken by the ear, so, by your long honorably dead father. I have looked at your hand. It is not like his hand. Also have I looked at the ear of Li Faa. Never will you lead her by the ear. She has not that kind of an ear. I shall live a long time yet, and I will be mistress in my son's house, after our ancient way, until I die. But she is my revered ancestress, Ah Kim explained to Li Faa. He was timidly unhappy, for Li Faa, having ascertained that Mrs. Tai Fu was at the temple of the Chinese Aesculapius making a food offering of dried duck and prayers for her declining health, had taken advantage of the opportunity to call upon him in his store. Li Faa pursed her insolent, unpainted lips into the form of a half-opened rosebud, and replied. That will do for China. I do not know China. This is Hawaii, and in Hawaii the customs of all foreigners change. She is nevertheless my ancestress, Ah Kim protested, the mother who gave me birth, whether I am in China or Hawaii, O silvery moon blossom that I want for wife. I have had 2 husbands, Li Faa stated placidly. One was a Paik, one was a Portuguese. I learned much from both. Also am I educated. I have been to high school, and I have played the piano in public. And I learned from my 2 husbands much. The Paik makes the best husband. Never again will I marry anything but a Paik. But he must not take me by the ear. How do you know of that? He broke in suspiciously. Mrs. Chang Lucy, was the reply. Mrs. Chang Lucy tells me everything that your mother tells her, and your mother tells her much. So let me tell you that mine is not that kind of an ear. Which is what my honored mother has told me, Ah Kim groaned. Which is what your honored mother told Mrs. Chang Lucy, which is what Mrs. Chang Lucy told me, Li Faa completed equably. And I now tell you, O third husband-to-be, that the man is not born who will lead me by the ear. It is not the way in Hawaii. I will go only hand in hand with my man, side by side, 50-50 as is the Haole slang just now. My Portuguese husband thought different. He tried to beat me. I landed him 3 times in the police court and each time he worked out his sentence on the reef. After that he got drowned. My mother has been my mother for 50 years, Ah Kim declared stoutly. And for 50 years has she beaten you, Li Faa giggled. How my father used to laugh at Yap Ten Shin. Like you, Yap Ten Shin had been born in China, and had brought the China customs with him. His old father was forever beating him with a stick. He loved his father. But his father beat him harder than ever when he became a missionary Paik. Every time he went to the missionary services, his father beat him. And every time the missionary heard of it he was harsh in his language to Yap Ten Shin for allowing his father to beat him. And my father laughed and laughed, for my father was a very liberal Paik, who had changed his customs quicker than most foreigners. And all the trouble was because Yap Ten Shin had a loving heart. He loved his honorable father. He loved the God of love of the Christian missionary. But in the end, in me, he found the greatest love of all, which is the love of woman. In me he forgot his love for his father and his love for the loving Christ. And he offered my father 600 gold, for me the price was small because my feet were not small. But I was half Kanaka. I said that I was not a slave woman, and that I would be sold to no man. My high school teacher was a Haole old maid who said love of woman was so beyond price that it must never be sold. Perhaps that is why she was an old maid. She was not beautiful. She could not give herself away. My Kanaka mother said it was not the Kanaka way to sell their daughters for a money price. They gave their daughters for love, and she would listen to reason if Yap Ten Shin provided luaus in quantity and quality. My Paik father, as I have told you, was liberal. He asked me if I wanted Yap Ten Shin for my husband. And I said yes, and freely, of myself, I went to him. He it was who was kicked by a horse, but he was a very good husband before he was kicked by the horse. As for you, Ah Kim, you shall always be honorable and lovable for me, and some day, when it is not necessary for you to take me by the ear, I shall marry you and come here and be with you always, and you will be the happiest pig in all Hawaii, for I have had 2 husbands, and gone to high school, and am most wise in making a husband happy. But that will be when your mother has ceased to beat you. Mrs. Chang Lucy tells me that she beats you very hard. She does, Ah Kim affirmed. Behold. He thrust back his loose sleeves, exposing to the elbow his smooth and cherubic forearms. They were mantled with black and blue marks that advertised the weight and number of blows so shielded from his head and face. But she has never made me cry, Ah Kim disclaimed hastily. Never, from the time I was a little boy, has she made me cry. So Mrs. Chang Lucy says, Lee Faa observed. She says that your honorable mother often complains to her that she has never made you cry. A sibilant warning from one of his clerks was too late. Having regained the house by way of the back alley, Mrs. Tai Fu emerged right upon them from out of the living apartments. Never had Ah Kim seen his mother's eyes so blazing furious. She ignored Lee Faa, as she screamed at him. Now will I make you cry. As never before shall I beat you until you do cry. Then let us go into the back rooms, honorable mother, Kim suggested. We will close the windows and the doors, and there may you beat me. No. Here shall you be beaten before all the world and this shameless woman who would, with her own hand, take you by the ear and call such sacrilege marriage. Stay, shameless woman. I am going to stay anyway, said Lee Faa. She favored the clerks with a truculent stare. And I'd like to see anything less than the police put me out of here. You will never be my daughter-in-law, Mrs. Tai Fu snapped. Lee Faa nodded her head in agreement. But just the same, she added, shall your son be my 3rd husband? You mean when I am dead? The old mother screamed. The sun rises each morning, Lee Faa said enigmatically. All my life have I seen it rise. You are 40, and you wear corsets. But I do not dye my hair, that will come later, Lee Faa calmly retorted. As to my age, you are right. I shall be 41 next Kamehameha Day. For 40 years I have seen the sun rise. My father was an old man. Before he died he told me that he had observed no difference in the rising of the sun since when he was a little boy. The world is round. Confucius did not know that, but you will find it in all the geography books. The world is round. Ever it turns over on itself, over and over and around and around. And the times and seasons of weather and life turn with it. What is, has been before. What has been, will be again. The time of the breadfruit and the mango ever recurs, and man and woman repeat themselves. The robins nest, and in the springtime the plovers come from the north. Every spring is followed by another spring. The coconut palm rises into the air, ripens its fruit, and departs. But always are there more coconut palms. This is not all my own smart talk. Much of it my father told me. Proceed, Honorable Mrs. Tai Fu, and beat your son who is my 3rd husband to be. But I shall laugh. I warn you I shall laugh. Ah Kim dropped down on his knees so as to give his mother every advantage. And while she rained blows upon him with the bamboo stick, Lee Faa smiled and giggled, and finally burst into laughter. Harder, O Honorable Mrs. Tai Fu. Lee Faa urged between paroxysms of mirth. Mrs. Tai Fu did her best, which was notably weak, until she observed what made her drop the stick by her side in amazement. Ah Kim was crying. Down both cheeks great round tears were coursing. Lee Faa was amazed. So were the gaping clerks. Most amazed of all was Ah Kim, yet he could not help himself, and, although no further blows fell, he cried steadily on. But why did you cry? Lee Faa demanded often of Ah Kim. It was so perfectly foolish a thing to do. She was not even hurting you. Wait until we are married, was Ah Kim's invariable reply, and then, oh Moon Lily, will I tell you. 2 years later, one afternoon, more like a watermelon seed in configuration than ever, Ah Kim returned home from a meeting of the Chinese Protective Association, to find his mother dead on her couch. Narrower and more unrelenting than ever were the forehead and the brushed back hair. But on her face was a withered smile. The gods had been kind. She had passed without pain. He telephoned first of all to Li Fei's number but did not find her until he called up Mrs. Chang Lucy. The news given, the marriage was dated ahead with 10 times the brevity of the old-line Chinese custom. And if there be anything analogous to a bridesmaid in a Chinese wedding, Mrs. Chang Lucy was just that. Why, Li Fei asked Ah Kim when alone with him on their wedding night, why did you cry when your mother beat you that day in the store? You were so foolish. She was not even hurting you. That is why I cried, answered Ah Kim. Li Fei looked up at him without understanding. I cried, he explained, because I suddenly knew that my mother was nearing her end. There was no weight, no hurt, in her blows. I cried because I knew she no longer had strength enough to hurt me. That is why I cried, my flower of serenity, my perfect rest. That is the only reason why I cried. Waikiki, Honolulu. June 16, 1916.